Back in 2021, the reporter Maddie Stone pitched us a story on something that was happening at Microsoft. At the time, people were starting to get a little bit more aware of the fact that tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon were selling products to fossil fuel companies that were helping those companies to drill for oil and gas faster, more efficiently. And in doing that, they were, in effect, helping to increase greenhouse gas emissions. Never mind that they all had big, bold, net zero, low carbon claims. Maddie had also gotten a tip that some of the technology that Microsoft was selling to fossil fuel companies was also increasing worker surveillance. None of that sounded good, so we said, sure, go for it. And she wrote this great story for us. It's still on our website today. It's called Big Oil, Big Profits, Big Brother. As a result of that story, several Microsoft employees contacted Maddie to let her know that they were trying to agitate inside the company for Microsoft to take a stronger stance on all of these issues. Those folks stayed in touch over the years. A couple of them ended up leaving because they felt like they just were never going to be able to change the company. And now those people are speaking out for the first time ever in a big news story co-published by Grist and Drilled and written by Maddie again. She's joined me today to walk me through that story, what exactly is going on with Microsoft, and why it is so reticent to say goodbye to those big oil contracts. That's coming up after this quick break. I'm Amy Westervelt, and this is Spill.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Test, check 1, 2. You know you need unique New York. You know you need unique New York. Does that sound all right? Ah, that's better. You can always tell something's missing when you get isolated results, like AI that's only right for one of your systems. Get AI that can work across your data and applications. Learn more at IBM.com. The AI built for business. IBM.
I first started looking into Microsoft's engagements with the fossil fuel industry that could be leading to significant climate damage back around 2019. And this is really when some of the initial news stories started to trickle out about how big tech, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, Meta to a lesser extent, we're sort of going all in on partnering with oil and gas companies and oil field service providers to, quote, bring them into the digital age. So the idea was that these energy companies have huge troves of data stored, locally or in small data centers that they were not necessarily making use of in the most efficient way possible. And this was when tech companies were vastly expanding their large data centers and their cloud computing divisions and offering these really sophisticated computing tools to a variety of industries in order to help them kind of crunch their data, gain new insights from it, maybe optimize something about the efficiency of their operations. And all of these tech companies started looking at the fossil fuel industry and realizing this was potentially a really significant new revenue stream for them. If they could create partnerships with these companies, get them to migrate their servers over to, Microsoft Azure, which is the company's cloud computing division. And then they would, in addition to providing cloud hosting services, offer a variety of software tools, sometimes even working with their in-house engineers to develop custom and specialized tools that would allow them to crunch and analyze their data in new ways in order to streamline their operations, boost efficiency, maybe discover new things in their data that they hadn't seen before, like new pockets of oil and gas that they could be exploiting in some way. And so this is something that all of these big tech companies started to get into in probably around 2016, 2017 timeframe. And then around late 2018, 2019, the press started to pick up on that a little bit. I have to give a shout out to Brian Merchant, who was working for Gizmodo at the time and wrote an article that sort of busted this story out into the open. I think it was titled something like How Big Tech is Automating the Climate Crisis, or How Microsoft, Google, and Amazon are automating the climate crisis, simply pointing out that these companies were inking these lucrative deals with oil and gas companies to provide them with these specialized software tools to help them find and extract more oil. And this was around the very same time that workers, employees at these companies were starting to grow concerned more broadly about the climate impact of the companies, of their carbon footprints, what they were doing to reduce their emissions. And so it was sort of this perfect storm of an awakening among employees at these companies that, wow, this giant corporation I work for has a huge carbon footprint. What are they doing about it? And at the same time, shrewd journalists starting to point out that, in fact, that carbon footprint may be way bigger than anyone has really attempted to imagine, because of the way that these tech companies are enabling the fossil fuel industry to find, extract, and burn more oil. And so that was probably when I started looking into it, as, when employee activism around climate became sort of a national phenomenon in 2019, and when a few early reports started trickling out in the media on these partnerships.
Yeah, I think the first thing I ever saw that made me go like, oh, was Brian Merchant's story that you mentioned. And then just seeing like Microsoft and Amazon and all these tech company logos as like sponsors on a bunch of oil and gas conferences.
And that raises another good point, which was back in this 2018 to 2020 era, these tech companies weren't doing anything to hide this. This was before, I think, they were really getting scrutinized by their workforce, their investors, the broader public, for everything they were doing on climate and sustainability. And they were, for the most part, happy to put out a press release touting a new partnership with ExxonMobil that was going to, expand production in Texas by tens of thousands of barrels per day. I'm citing an actual press release that Microsoft put out in 2019 there. And yeah, they were very open about these partnerships. They were excited about them. They wanted to communicate them to the world because this was like a big business opportunity for them. And once the backlash started to come, those press releases really started to die down and take on a very different tone. It was, less about, here's all the great work we're doing helping the oil companies extract more oil. And it was very much more about, here's how we're being technology partners for an energy company seeking to transition into the new sort of digital age, or maybe even explicitly mentioning some small renewable energy project they were doing with BP and highlighting that as if that were the whole scope of what they were doing with the company.
Okay, let's talk about this most recent story of yours, because it's a belter. Tell me about how this kind of first got on your radar and what some of these former employees are saying about their time at Microsoft and how they tried to kind of change the company from the inside and what happened.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'd sort of been tracking Microsoft's involvement in this space since 2019, 2020. I did some reporting for Drilled several years back, looking at some of the partnerships Microsoft was inking with fossil fuel giants and, discussing why those were problematic from a climate perspective. But the really tough nut to crack was always getting employees on the record, and hearing what the workers at Microsoft had to say about this. Around the same time, there was a very sort of vocal and public movement taking place at Amazon, calling attention to its work with the fossil fuel company. And workers had sort of organized a public-facing campaign to kind of name and shame their employers about these contracts and try to push for change that way. But workers at Microsoft were comparably fairly quiet on what was happening at Microsoft. And so I was always curious whether this was a conversation taking place internally and if workers were raising concerns about it, but maybe we're just, working through different channels. And it turns out that that's really exactly what was happening. There was a sort of employee awakening to this problem beginning in late 2019, and then a years-long campaign internally at Microsoft, spearheaded by a small group of employees, to basically continually raise this issue with management, with really the upper echelons of Microsoft leadership, that Microsoft was enabling these emissions within the fossil fuel industry by providing them all these technology tools, and why that was a problem and why that ran counter to everything Microsoft was saying it was doing on climate. And how I initially started to discover that this was happening, I think it was back in March of 2022, Microsoft, without much fanfare and very out of the blue, put out this short blog post discussing, it was titled something like, working with the energy industry, or our evolving work with the energy industry going forward. And it was all about how Microsoft's energy division was thinking about the future of its work with fossil fuel companies, essentially. And there were some nice platitudes in there about how the Microsoft energy division wants to focus more on zero carbon and renewable energy projects, on how it would be encouraging its clients to make net zero commitments and work toward net zero targets. And then there was a much more sort of specific line toward the end of this pretty short blog post that Microsoft put out, stating that Microsoft was going to continue to develop custom software tools to enable oil and gas extraction, but that it would only do so for energy companies that had a net zero target. And so this blog post, again, I'd been sort of following this issue as closely as I could through what Microsoft was putting out publicly. And it felt like it came a little bit out of the blue. This was about 2 years after Greenpeace put out a report called Oil in the Cloud, calling attention to these partnerships. So I sort of wondered what spurred it. And I came across some LinkedIn blog posts and discussions by some employees at Microsoft at the time, indicating that employees at Microsoft had actually been pushing for something like this, for Microsoft to put out some sort of, statement of principles of how it was going to continue to work with the fossil fuel industry and, what it was going to do to hold itself accountable for those emissions. And so I ended up connecting with a couple of employees who were involved in that effort, who, again, back in spring of 2022, we're still very much in the thick of it internally, trying to raise this issue and hoping that real change would come about as a result of their advocacy. And were very reticent to go on the record with a journalist at the time because they felt like it would undermine their internal strategy. So I kind of learned that this was going on, but wasn't really able to move on it and do a story at the time. And then about a year and a half later, got back in touch with some of these employees at just the right time, and learned that a few employees who had been very close to this effort were actually leaving the company because they were so fed up with how little Microsoft had done over the years, that they'd been advocating for it to stop basically enabling additional oil extraction. And at that point, some of these former employees were, much more willing to go on the record and start putting public pressure on Microsoft because this internal strategy, while it had seen some success over the years, they felt like it had really hit a wall, and Microsoft was not willing to enact the meaningful changes that they were advocating for.
Shout out to LinkedIn as a weirdly helpful reporting tool.
Totally. Yeah.
It really is.
It's where the party's at these days, I guess, if you work at a giant tech company.
Okay, so I want to talk about some of the specifics that you mentioned in this story in terms of just how much these employees were trying to get the company to basically stop working with the oil and gas industry to boost its productivity, and what Microsoft's response has been to that.
I want to be very clear up front, and this is something the former employees I spoke with really emphasized in my conversations with them, that employees were never asking Microsoft to fully sever ties with the fossil fuel industry. I would say at most they were asking Microsoft to, stop developing tools that were enabling additional oil and gas extraction, but they were never asking the company to necessarily walk away from working with this industry entirely. They just wanted to see any work that Microsoft was doing with the fossil fuel industry as being much more aligned with, addressing the climate crisis and with Microsoft's own internal sustainability goals, which are pretty ambitious as far as tech industry sustainability goals go. The company has a plan to be carbon negative, quote unquote, by 2030. So these employees wanted to see any work Microsoft was doing with the fossil fuel industry as much more clearly aligned with that goal. And so that would be, work that was really in a meaningful way, I think, helping to phase down fossil fuel production and increase, zero carbon and renewable energy production, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, Microsoft has sort of created this narrative over the years that is what it's doing, even though that doesn't really appear to be the case. So when employees first started asking questions about this, there were a series of employee town hall meetings in the fall of 2019. And at a few of these meetings, which I reviewed transcripts from, employees went up to an open mic and asked CEO Satya Nadella, how does Microsoft square these partnerships with the oil and gas industry that are enabling additional extraction with its climate goals? And, with the fact that we have a responsibility to create a livable future on this planet. And the response that Microsoft's CEO gave in a couple of different ways when he was asked this question was, the energy transition is complicated. These oil and gas companies are active participants in it. We're not just going to cut them off. We need to help them transition. And by providing them with tools that are, boosting the efficiency of their operations and increasing their bottom line, we're somehow sort of enabling them to put more resources toward the energy transition. And so the implication there was that by helping oil companies become more profitable, Microsoft was doing a good thing for the climate that was going to encourage these oil companies to invest more in renewable energy. I mean, the $1 million question there is that what these oil companies are actually doing? And I think the evidence over the last 6 years indicates that no, that's not what they're doing. They're all,
Right.
Walking back their net zero commitments, investing, pitifully small amounts of their revenue in their low and zero carbon energy divisions. But this is sort of the line that Microsoft leadership has maintained since employees started asking that question about 6 years ago at this point.
This response is the same thing that you hear from like PR firms and lots of universities and all of that stuff is like, but we're helping them. But what you see in fossil fuel company strategies and documents and whatnot is that these entities are being used to help them maintain their fossil fuel business.
It's like there's this underlying assumption that by simply providing them with technology, they will choose to be good actors or better actors. They'll choose to do things with that technology that, Microsoft or workers or people who are concerned about climate change want them to do just because they have access to these fancy new tools.
Yeah, totally. Can we talk about Microsoft's quote unquote carbon negative by 2030 goal and what exactly that means and how it's measuring that? I want to talk about that in the context of sustainability reporting in general, because, I get the sense that part of what is enabling Microsoft to not do much about these issues that the employees have pointed out is that most people don't know or don't think of them as being connected to these emissions because they don't really have to report them or they've chosen not to.
I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head there. So Microsoft in January of 2020 put out this big announcement, this pledge that it was going to become quote unquote carbon negative by 2030, meaning that a decade from when the announcement was made, the company would be pulling more carbon out of the air than it emitted on an annual basis. And it would do this by following a protocol, a set of rules for measuring and accounting for its carbon footprint that are used very widely across the business world. So this is something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that is essentially very detailed set of instructions for companies that want to take stock of their climate impact and try to reduce it as much as possible. And roughly speaking, this greenhouse gas protocol breaks corporate emissions down into 3 different scopes. They're called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 and 2 are sort of the more direct emissions that the company is responsible for that you might think of, like emissions associated with the electricity used to power the data centers or to keep the lights on in the offices, or the emissions related to employee air travel to conferences, for example. So those more direct emissions related to things like power and transportation fall under Scope 1 and Scope 2. Scope 3 is this much broader basket of emissions that have to do with the company's supply chain, how its products are used. The Scope 3 emissions of companies, big and small, tend to be larger than Scopes 1 and Scope 2, because if you think about a corporation like, let's say, Apple, for example, Apple sells lots of phones and laptops. All of those devices need to be manufactured. Those emissions associated with that manufacturing supply chain tend to be pretty large compared with the power needed to charge a phone, for example. And so those Scope 3 emissions are bigger, they're more complicated, and they're a little bit harder to get a handle on. But what Microsoft was saying was it was going to account for all of those supply chain emissions, all of those Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and it was going to effectively cancel them out and more by also investing in various carbon removal strategies. So things like, growing back forests or direct air capture, which is a very nascent industry that Microsoft has put some money into, sucking carbon out of the sky. So it was considered very ambitious and sort of set a new standard for the tech industry at the time when Microsoft made this announcement. However, left out of that Scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon reporting framework is another almost more difficult to quantify set of emissions. And those are sometimes referred to as Scope 4, sometimes referred to as something like enabled emissions, which is what these Microsoft employees are calling them. And these are the emissions associated with the technology, with the knowledge, with the services a company is performing for another client. So in this case, Microsoft is assigning engineers to work with companies like Exxon and Chevron to help them figure out how to boost oil production. And that is having a tangible impact on the atmosphere. But it's not something that falls within that, circle that Microsoft is drawing around its emissions. It's outside of it. It's indirect. Another example of that might be if you think about an advertising or PR firm creating an ad for an oil company that ultimately helps that oil company sell more of its products. That would not be considered a scope 1, 2, or 3 emission, but it is emissions that company is enabling. And so what employees at Microsoft asserted was that these indirect or enabled emissions were potentially far greater than the emissions directly associated with Microsoft's operations. And yet the company was doing nothing to account for them. It wasn't even, on sort of a high level considering whether that type of work aligned with its carbon negative goal. And it's not just employees at Microsoft who have raised concerns about this. There's actually a working group at a UN-affiliated organization called Race to Zero that is trying to come up with guidelines for professional service providers to address these sorts of serviced or enabled emissions. So the emissions associated with providing advice or knowledge and how that can potentially unlock far greater, benefits for the planet or create much bigger climate problems than those companies could necessarily do on their own.
What has Microsoft's response to you on this particular story been? How is it handling the fact that, these employees left in part over this stuff and that one of them at least is now speaking to the press?
The response has been, I would say, cordial without directly engaging in too much of the substantive criticism that employees are making. Their spokesperson told me that employees are, a core part of Microsoft's sustainability mission, that executives engage with employee groups regularly and maintain an open dialogue. The spirit of it was very we like to engage with employees. We love it when they bring their concerns to us. And, then Microsoft went on to provide me this sort of short statement reiterating their so-called energy principles, the principles they use to guide their work with the fossil fuel industry, which effectively amount to, we'll work with you if you say you have a net zero target. But I reached out to Microsoft requesting an interview. When I didn't get any follow-up about that, I sent a really detailed list of questions and sort of a timetable of the facts of what employees have been doing behind the scenes over the course of close to 5 years to raise this issue, to demand greater transparency and accountability for the company. I listed out a number of commitments that Microsoft senior leadership made to employees on multiple different occasions. In the story, I discuss a call that energy division lead Daryl Willis took with this internal Microsoft sustainability community in November of 2022. This was after Microsoft had put out that blog post describing its so-called energy principles. On that call, employees sort of peppered him with questions about, what does it mean when you say you're only going to work with a fossil fuel company that has a net zero commitment? What are you doing to actually ensure that that company is working toward that commitment? Are you having conversations with these oil and gas companies about their scope 3 emissions? Because that's another important thing about Microsoft's energy principles document that it put out. It said that it would work with oil and gas companies that are committed to reducing or zeroing out their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Those emissions do not include the burning of fossil fuels. Those are the emissions associated with producing the fuels, which are a much smaller slice of an oil company's emissions. And so I reached out to Microsoft, raising these criticisms, raising the fact that on this call with employees, Daryl Willis committed to, getting back to them with answers, to providing more detail, to giving updates on how they were making operationalizing the principles and planning to transition the energy division's revenue away from fossil fuels and toward renewable energy. According to the former employees I spoke with, Microsoft has made good on none of those promises and provided me, when I reached out to the company, with no additional information indicating otherwise. So, by all accounts, it does seem that employees have been trying their hardest to hold the company's feet to the fire on this. And when it comes to enacting meaningful change, Microsoft really seems unwilling to budge.
Mm-hmm. I know Bill Gates isn't directly involved with Microsoft anymore, but I do feel like his sort of general, throw technology at it as the fix for all things, including climate, just feels very baked into the DNA here. And I'm just curious what you think about that and if that's something that has come up with the employees as well.
Yeah. The idea that just creating this technology is a net good for the world. I would say that is.
And that data in and of itself is addressing the problem, we're collecting data on the energy use of this, that, and the other, as though the data, the data collection alone is doing something.
Yeah, I would say that is very much in keeping with the spirit of what the executives at Microsoft have been saying when employees interrogate them on this issue. The employees, I think, have been a lot shrewder. And the ones who have really been repeatedly raising this issue of enabled emissions have pointed out repeatedly that the devil's in the details, and just creating technology and giving that technology to people across different industries isn't necessarily going to lead to positive outcomes. There was a memo that I cite in my reporting that a small group of employees crafted and delivered to Microsoft President Brad Smith. Very detailed memo on this enabled emissions issue, outlining a series of recommendations for how to align Microsoft's provision of cloud computing, AI technology with its climate goals. And one of the recommendations in that memo, just to paraphrase, was accounting for those enabled emissions. So taking a hard look at the industries Microsoft was working with and trying to figure out a way to calculate whether that was a net positive or a net negative, which would really answer that question of whether putting technology out in the world on its own is enough to achieve positive outcomes. And that was not a recommendation that Microsoft followed through on. So I do think that there has been this sort of corporate platitude repeated over and over that, we're just providing a technology service and we're discussing the transition with our clients, we're encouraging them, but it's almost like Microsoft is unwilling to really do the math on whether that technology is providing a net benefit or a net positive, maybe because they are worried about what the results of that will be.
Spill is a climate news and culture podcast brought to you by the teams behind Drilled and Hot Take. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was engineered by Peter Duff. You can find the stories that we mentioned in this episode on the Drilled website at drilled.media. Go check them out.